Tēnā mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, tauta mai, ki tēnei, kaupapa, whakahirahira. Kia ora and good morning. Thank you so much for coming in from the wonderful Canterbury morning that we have put on this morning. I know that's been pretty challenging actually. It's such a beautiful morning out there. I'm Leanne Watson, the Chief Executive at the Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you this morning to Canterbury Insights Forum. This is a collaboration between the Chamber, Christchurch New Zealand and Research First, and it's the first time we've run this initiative together, so it's great to see such a strong turnout. Today's forum explores how our economy, workforce and our community are really doing. We'll present our findings from the research each organisation has conducted, and then we'll take a deep dive into the trends, the themes and the issues, with an opportunity also for you to have your say and to ask some questions. We'll be asking for your feedback on some of the key areas that will inform the discussion component of the session. So today we'll hear from Sophie Jones, the Economic Analyst at ChristchurchNZ, on the Economic Insights report. Carl Davidson, the Director at Research First, who will present their findings from the pulse of the Christchurch survey, and I will present the Chamber's latest results from our quarterly Canterbury Business Survey. For the panel discussion that will follow, Carl will be joined by Christchurch New Zealand's Chief Executive, Ali Adams, and Graham Grant, the Chief Executive of Sequent, one of our very significant companies here in the region who are doing some amazing things. And Ali will also then close the session with some closing remarks. Just before I continue, I do want to acknowledge a couple of people. Firstly, welcome to Christchurch Mayor Phil Major, and also we've got some city councillors present here, and I also have a number of the Chamber board members here today. A huge thank you to ANSCO, Christchurch NZ and Research First, who without their support today would simply not have been possible. The bathrooms are located in the foyer where you came in and had your breakfast, and also there are some at the back of the auditorium. In the event of an emergency, please follow the instructions of the team here at Majestic. And finally, if you haven't done so already, if you can just turn your phones to silent. So the session is being recorded today, and we will make sure that we send you the recording along with all the presentations. For the interactive part of the session, we will be using an online platform. So if you can whip out your phones, and it's on the screen hopefully behind me, go to pigeonhole.at/chamber to access this. Some of you will have used it before. It's a platform that we use quite regularly. It's pretty easy to use. So I'd now like to welcome our first speaker, Sophie Jones, the Economic Analyst at Christchurch NZ. Welcome, Sophie.
Kia ora everyone, my name is Sophie and I'm an Economic Analyst at Christchurch NZ. Today I'm going to run you through some of the key economic trends from the December quarter. In the time spent in my role, I've learnt there is one thing that will make people's eyes glaze over even faster than telling them that you're an economist, and that is telling people you will spend the next 10 minutes talking to them about complex economic statistics. So instead, today we will be focusing first and foremost on the insight to ensure that we get the most out of the numbers, with the goal being that you walk away from today with a few gems of knowledge about the Ōtautahi Christchurch economy. Firstly, let's look at employment figures for Q4. Labour and skills shortages continue to be a key challenge for businesses, with unemployment remaining at historically low levels. Local and national unemployment increased slightly during Q4, but this was largely driven by an increase in the size of the labour force, rather than people moving from employment into unemployment. This is unsurprising for the December quarter, when we tend to see students moving into the labour force for summer. To explore this more, within a working age population, there are people in the labour force who are employed or actively seeking work, and people who are outside of the labour force. These tend to be people engaged in unpaid childcare, are in study, or are working age but have retired. In recent quarters, more and more people who were previously outside of the labour force have been drawn into it. And so although the unemployment rate increased in Q4, the number of employed people also went up because the labour force got larger overall. Labour force participation, which is the share of the working age population that is in the labour force, is now at record highs, for example, hitting 73.7% in Canterbury. Consumer confidence scores remain at levels previously only seen in the GFC, both locally and nationally. Anything under 100 for consumer confidence indicates that pessimistic sentiment outweighs optimistic sentiment. On average, over the last 10 years, it's sat around 107. Scores are now in the 70s. There are three key forces eroding consumer confidence: cost of living pressures, rising interest rates, and a declining housing market. We will take a closer look at some of those. Although pessimistic, confidence in Canterbury is above the national average. Canterbury will likely emerge as one of the more confident regions this year due to the strength of agricultural incomes, recovery in the tourism sector, and the relatively smaller declines in the housing market that we have seen compared to other regions so far. Moving now to look at the lending environment and how that relates to confidence. For the average Kiwi household, increases to interest rates over the last year have led to a 45% increase in interest payments. While we used to see mortgage rates around the 6 to 7% mark 10 or so years ago, the relationship between incomes and house prices has shifted since then. Mortgage rates were last where they are now in early 2011, and back then the average ratio of incomes to house prices in New Zealand was 5. It's now at 7.8, so servicing the average mortgage has become more difficult. We ran an analysis on how mortgage expenses have changed for a Christchurch household that purchased a home at the median price in January 2021. With a 20% deposit, they could have secured a 2-year interest rate of around 2.6%, which equates to a weekly mortgage payment of $384. When they refixed in January this year, the equivalent rate had risen to just under 6.6%, and that weekly payment had risen to almost $600. This means that same household now needs an additional $11,000 per year for interest alone. With a much larger proportion of incomes going to mortgage payments, we can see how the OCR flows through to influence on demand. Looking now at house prices, this graph is showing where the market is sitting in each major region by comparing the peak median price from 2021, which is that black bar, with the median price as at January this year, which is the blue bar. You can see that the Canterbury market peaked lower and later than the others and has fallen by just over 11% since then. Nationally, the median price has dropped by around 17%. This is where a second influence on demand comes into play, which is called the wealth effect. The wealth effect is when, as house prices fall, people feel less asset rich, and so even if they aren't looking to sell their home, they tend to pull back on their spending anyway. This has an additional impact on demand and again ties back to those low confidence scores. So given all of this, how is retail spending looking in Christchurch? When we look at transactions for Q4, we can see that the volume of spending by locals, so that's the number of card swipes carried out by residents of Greater Christchurch, was down just under 1% compared to the same quarter in 2021. Those contractions in spending came through in hospitality and in home and recreation retail, and was equivalent to around 92,000 fewer transactions. However, when we add visitor spend in and look at all transactions overall, spending volumes were up 3% over the same period. So that means that this drop in spending by locals has been offset by an uplift in visitor spending in Christchurch. We can see really strong growth in that other consumer spending category, which captures tourism and recreation product. So top line figures are up, with visitor spend cushioning the impact of that underlying local trend. That brings us to the next key trend from Q4, which is recovery in the tourism sector. There were just under 90,000 international arrivals at Christchurch Airport in Q4, plus visitation from cruise ships. Although visitor numbers are at around half of pre-COVID levels, visitor spending is generally at or above the 2019 pre-COVID equivalent. And that's due to the type of visitor market that we have seen the strongest recovery in so far, which is independent travellers. Those are people who tend to spend more once they're here, rather than booking and paying for tours and packages before they depart their home country. We expect to see this gap closing with the reopening of the Chinese tourism market. Another area where Christchurch and Canterbury more broadly has been pulling some underlying strength from is our export sector. Global inflation means that import prices are at historically high levels, which has seen that gap between exports and imports, also known as the trade balance, closing. But this also means that we receive higher prices for our commodity exports, and that's supporting Canterbury's trade balance and keeping that gap net positive. Although we saw some cooling in agricultural prices in recent quarters, they remain high in historic terms, and we expect the reopening of the Chinese economy to support further growth in export prices. So overall, the key trends show that the local economy is subject to the same high-level pressures as the rest of the country. Confidence is at historic lows, and that's due to three driving forces: cost of living pressures, rising interest rates, and a falling housing market. We do, however, see some key green shoots or sources of underlying strength for our local economy, including agricultural incomes and the return of international tourism. Despite facing a challenging economic environment, Canterbury is expected to emerge as one of the stronger performing regions in New Zealand over the next year. That brings us to the end of this segment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Some great information there. ChristchurchNZ compiled a significant amount of data, and as we've just seen, some really good insights in there. So it is available on their website, and I would certainly encourage you to go and use that as a great information source. It's no surprise that, as Sophie mentioned, consumer confidence is at an all-time low. We all feel the pain, whether or not that's at the weekly supermarket shop or filling up the car at the fuel station. And almost, of course, everyone here in this audience today, as a business, will be acutely aware of the ripple effect that the rising cost of living is having, and more accurately, the rising cost of everything is having on not only our consumers, but also across our business community. Business confidence levels, as mentioned, are also at a low. But I just want to talk a little bit about business confidence can, of course, be very subjective. Confidence to you may mean something quite different to the person you're sitting next to. And it can depend on a range of things, including your sector, your size, and your stage of business. So last year at the Chamber, we found ourselves asking the question, why is it that the economic indicators such as retail spending, our performance service index and performance manufacturing index, two other surveys that we run, were showing positive trends and improvements. The borders were reopening, the lockdown policies had been filed away, but why was it that business confidence measures in Canterbury were going in the opposite direction? So we embarked on a fact-finding mission. If those of you who will know, who receive our regular updates, and some of you contribute to our surveys, we conduct the quarterly Canterbury Business Survey to find out basically how businesses are feeling and how they're performing, but also, more importantly, what their intentions are for the future. I need to remember to click this slide. Confidence. So this survey is not necessarily about confidence, but it is about intentions. Intentions to invest, intentions to employ, and questions that we use to identify trends over time. And we are very often surprised by what the answers are actually telling us in comparison to what we are hearing and seeing through the media. So just quickly, some information about our methodology. The survey captures information from businesses throughout the entire Canterbury region, including Mid and North Canterbury. We collect responses from all business sizes, stages and sectors, and the data is validated and checked. And we repeat this on a quarterly basis. I'm going to share with you the results from our latest analysis before it is publicly released later today. So firstly, let's focus on the Canterbury economy. 23% of businesses, so nearly 1 in 4, expect the strength of our regional economy to improve in 12 months' time compared to today. Less than half of businesses expect it to worsen, mostly only slightly worse, but some think it will be substantially worse. This compares to more than half in the previous survey, so expectations are getting better. Canterbury businesses, have remarked that the positive attitude within the region and the relative ease of doing business combined with our housing stock and our reliable infrastructure is a positive attribute that sets us above other regions. When it comes to business performance, half of businesses in the region expect their own earnings to have substantially or moderately improved over the next year. This is a significant increase on the previous quarter by nearly 20%. Intention to invest is also increasing significantly, with 3/4, that's 3 in 4 businesses, expecting to invest within the next 12 months, and that's really positive. We found that Canterbury businesses, by and large, remark their own performance as steady as she goes. Those surveyed comment that our strong primary industry, manufacturing and construction backbone and our export sector that Sophie mentioned is keeping our economy in good shape. And as we've seen, the dip in domestic consumer confidence and retail spend is largely being offset, at least in the retail and hospitality sectors, by our increased tourism spend. To pivot ever so slightly, we also asked in this last survey what your thoughts were on sustainability, and we found that Canterbury businesses have a strong interest in managing their environmental footprint. We live in one of the most beautiful cities in New Zealand, after all. 66% of businesses consider sustainability when making decisions. A remarkable 29% place it at the front of their minds. 1 in 4 businesses are willing to invest in carbon measurement, reductions or offsetting. We ask you to share with us the big issues that are creating a barrier to your performance, to your growth and also to your productivity. Unsurprisingly, labour market shortages reign supreme and top the list yet again, and we think they'll do so for the foreseeable future. Some of you may have seen a release that we put out yesterday following a report that we commissioned on the future of the workforce supply, which highlights by 2048 it is expected we'll have a shortfall of 250,000 people across New Zealand. Inflationary pressures and interest rate rises, as well as consumer confidence levels, form the top 3, with employment law changes including fair pay agreements and of course immigration policy settings coming in, and I'm sure none of these will be a surprise to any of you here today. At least here in Canterbury, as Sophie mentioned, our unemployment rate is slightly higher and we have slightly more slack than other regions. We also have a pull factor. People want to move here, they want to live here and they want to work here. We're not plagued with an hour-long commute. We still have a relatively affordable housing market in comparison to other cities. Our commercial rent is very reasonable compared to the other 2 main cities, so we are a very compelling proposition. 57% of businesses say it's more difficult to acquire or retain staff now compared to 12 months ago, no surprises there. And this compares to the previous quarter where 69% found it more difficult. So again, we're seeing some slight improvements. And within the previous 12 months, 34% of businesses surveyed have employed staff from outside of the Canterbury region who have subsequently moved to our city. We're seeing inward domestic migration, not outward, and the same cannot be said for Auckland and Wellington, giving us a competitive advantage right now. However, one thing that has been on the mind of businesses is law and order. We're seeing an increase in crime and antisocial behaviour, and perceptions of the severity of it are increasing. Following our open letter to government late last year, we're beginning to see some traction, and we anticipate hopefully some additional funding and resource to make sure that we can address those issues. And I know the Mayor is doing a great job on advocating really strongly for that to happen. Last slide. No, it's not. So it says lastly on here. It's not the last slide. Lastly, on the government, we've asked how the government is performing when it comes to managing the broader New Zealand economy. 3 out of 5 of you think it is worse than 12 months ago. 4 out of 5 of you think New Zealand is heading in the wrong direction, which is a little sobering. We didn't ask the question regionally, and perhaps we should have. Maybe we'll do that next time. But I want you to think about this right now. You've heard the insights from Sophie, and we're soon going to hear some further insights from Carl. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. So the question is Canterbury heading in the right direction or the wrong direction? And what is the story that we are telling ourselves? What role do we have in the story that we're telling ourselves, the narrative that we're setting for our workplaces, for the people that we employ, for the communities that we live in? I'll now hand over to Carl Davidson, the Director of Research First, to share his findings from the Pulse of the Christchurch survey. Welcome, Carl.
Tēnā koutou katoa, everybody. So we're Research First, and we're a Christchurch Insights agency with a social science heart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a social science perspective on economic resilience. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about what our research says about what people love about this place. So we run Research First has its roots and its heart here in Christchurch. We're a nationwide company, but this is where we started, so we love the place. So every year, for a number of years, we've been doing a piece of research we call the Pulse of Christchurch, where we've been talking to residents like you about what's going on. So that's what I want to talk about. Let's start with the really simple stuff. What do people like about Christchurch? Was anybody here at Sting last night? Fantastic. Did you hear what Sting's son said? Sting's son says Christchurch was what London would be like if London was nicer. I thought that was a beautiful thing to say, right? So when we ask people what they like about Christchurch, we get exactly what you'd expect. They think it's the right size, it's a beautiful city, and there's lots of opportunity. But the thing about social science is that we know that you can't just ask people about, what do you like about your job, your study, your city, because memory and brains are full of bias, and particularly we worry about availability bias, what's the most available answer to you, and recency bias, what's the most recent thing you've heard. So we ask the question in a different way. What we say to people is, think about where in Christchurch or Canterbury you feel most at home, most calm and at home, not counting your home or the home of your friends. I want you all to do that for me. Because when we do that, what we consistently see is people love the gardens in the city, the botanic gardens, they love the hills, and they love the beaches, right? Think about how many people from outside of Christchurch think about Christchurch as being a city of beaches and hills, right? Love it. Except for the social scientists in the room, and I know there are some of you, and I'm thinking of you, Kent. Of course, this is not the right way to ask the question either, because we asked it in summer, and we deliberately asked about at ease and calm. So then we asked, when you have people visiting from out of town, where do you take them? Where do you take people out of town? And you see the same results. We take them to the beaches, we take them to the hills, but the city centre comes back in at this point. We take them to the city centre, and we particularly take them to Riverside, Mike. So we love this. Now, these are small percentages because it's a long tail. There's lots and lots of answers, right? So then we ask the question another way. We say, all right, well, tell us when you're talking to people who don't live in Christchurch, what do you tell them about Christchurch? And this is what they tell them. Just that wasn't supposed to happen like that. Don't worry about that. That's not scripted. So it's really easy to get around. It's full of nice people. It's full of opportunity. What this research tells us is that the people that live here recognise that this is a great place. So if this was just a marketing presentation, this is when I'd say, let's fade to black, cue the music, and I'd walk away, right? It's a special place. It's an amazing place to live, work, and play, and we should all be proud of it. Except as a social scientist, I have to tell you that facts are really stubborn things, and that's not all our research says. And our role here today is really to be a critical friend. So we're here to help you guys in the business community understand what can we do to help Christchurch become more economically resilient. What does the research actually say? So this is where the presentation takes a turn for the worse. Okay, let's have a show of hands. In general, how many people in the room think that Christchurch's best days are behind us? Not a single hand's gone up. When we ask this question, 1 in 5 residents tell us that our best days are behind us. How many people think we're living through Christchurch's best days right now? Fantastic. Okay, how many people think Christchurch's best days are in front of us? Right. Okay, so there's an awful lot of optimism in the room. So when we ask residents, stubbornly, a fifth of residents tell us that our best days are behind us. And then we ask the question in a different way, and this is the one that always breaks my heart. We ask people, do you think Christchurch was better before the earthquakes than it was in 2023? Let's do it again. Anybody here think that Christchurch was better before the earthquakes than today? All right, well, when we ask it, we regularly get between a quarter and a third of residents telling us that they think Christchurch was better before the earthquakes than 2023. I'm going to say that again. When we ask the question, between a quarter and a third of Christchurch residents tell us they think Christchurch was better before the earthquakes than it is today. And when you double down on this, when you actually drill into it, there's a bunch of people who are fundamentally adamant Christchurch was much, much better before the earthquakes than it is today. So we get this dispersion of views. We have this small number of people who are passionate that Christchurch is much better today than it was, and a small number of people who say it was much, much better then than it is now. Now, again, as an insight company with a social science heart, we put our psychological lens over this, and what we know is people don't mean that. Like, we know that people don't mean that. Nobody really remembers 2010 or 11, clearly. 15% of the adults in the city weren't even here for the earthquakes. There are two phenomena that psychologists point to. One is rosy retrospection. When you look back, you tend to remember the good bits and forget the bad bits, which is why you like your ex-girlfriends and boyfriends in high school. You don't remember what it was actually like. And the other thing's called the Zeigarnik effect, which is our brains are drawn to incomplete tasks, much more readily than complete tasks. So it's much easier for people to point to the things that we haven't finished than it is the things we have finished, right? So it's easy to understand why people might say Christchurch was better. Okay, so that's why, but let's try and unpack what's going on there. And again, with our social science hat on, what we know, with the greatest love in the world, a lot of the things we tell about ourselves in Christchurch simply aren't true, right? We're no more community-minded than anybody else. The earthquakes haven't made us any more resilient than anybody else. We're no more innovative than anybody else. We don't even do the outdoors more than anybody else. All of these things are what psychologists call kind fibs. Your relationships run on kind fibs, your families run on kind fibs, and communities run on kind fibs, right? We tell these lies about ourselves, and they're great for marketing purposes, but they're not great for community resilience purposes. So, what I want to talk about with the few minutes I've got left, and obviously this research project's much bigger than this, there's far more data, but I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about social cohesion, loneliness, and trust. And if you're thinking, what the hell does social cohesion, loneliness, and trust have to do with economic resilience? You're in the wrong presentation, right? Because social cohesion, loneliness, and trust are what's called social capital. And social capital is what enables us as a group, a community, or an economy to do collectively what we can't do individually. And social capital comes in three kinds. It bonds us together in groups, it enables us to bridge between groups, and it links us with decision makers and other people in other groups. Bonding, bridging, and linking. You need social capital to prosper. Economies that have strong social capital do better than economies that have weak social capital. If you know anything about social capital, you've probably read Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. There are lots of people worried about social capital declining across the Western world for the last 20 years. I don't want to talk about that, I don't have time. I want to talk about how does social capital distribute in Christchurch. Okay, let's start with trust. In our 2023 Pulse research, a quarter of people said people in Christchurch can't usually be trusted. Just a quarter of you don't think you can trust other people, usually, right? This is the one that blew my mind. 56% of people say Christchurch isn't even safe enough for you to occasionally leave your door unlocked. So if you're just ducking to the store or taking the dog around the block, you've locked the door. How many of you go out without locking your door? Sometimes. Fantastic. Well, yeah, there are a lot of people in Christchurch that feel entirely differently. Okay, this begins to make more sense when you realise that 3% of people in Christchurch in our survey say they don't feel safe enough in their neighbourhood to go out during the day. 3% of people in Christchurch say they don't feel safe enough in their neighbourhood to go out during the day. There's 150,000 households in Christchurch, 3% is 4,500. It's a very small percentage, but it's a very large number. 17% say, I don't feel like safe enough to go out at night time. So safety is a problem. If you don't feel safe, you're unlikely to engage with your community. Perhaps as a result of that feeling of safety and trust, what our research has shown consistently is we have a problem with loneliness. We don't just have a problem with loneliness in Christchurch, we have a problem with loneliness in the Western world. It's called the loneliness epidemic. In our research, 20% of people, 20%, 1 in 5 of you said, there's nobody in my life online or physically that I feel comfortable to talking about intimate personal problems. 15% said, there's nobody in my life I can turn to for advice about making important decisions. This parallels really large international surveys where something like 23% of adult males in the UK say, I feel always or mostly alone. 1 in 5 adult men in the UK don't have any close friends. So we asked, we said, do you think it's harder to make friends today than it used to be? 55% of people said they thought it was. This is called the friendship recession. And here's the really interesting stat. If you're a middle-aged guy, you're most at risk. Because middle-aged guys, particularly post-divorce, have their social groups curated for them, often by their partners. It's called emotional housework and homework. 1 in 5 in the UK don't have any friends. Guys also suffer from a thing called weekend loneliness. Have lots of friends around them during the week because of work. On the weekend, nobody they can talk to. This is a huge problem. And because it's a huge problem, of course, the market has stepped in. There's a thing economists call the loneliness economy. Interestingly, social scientists call it the economy of misery. But the loneliness economy explains why number of pets has increased radically, why streaming services have gone through the roof. It explains things like apps where you can meet friends. It explains AI friends. It explains the sale of sex robots. It explains so many things about loneliness. In a world of loneliness, the market will step in. Nearly done. My point is, what the research says categorically is, this is going to get worse. Single-person households are the second most common type in New Zealand and the fastest growing. We're living in an ageing society. If we don't do something about this, cohesion, neighbourhoods, loneliness, trust, it's going to impact all of us. What I want to say today is we need to take the question of loneliness, social capital, social cohesion and trust much more seriously. We need to do that because it's going to be great for our economic resilience. It's going to help us get through a really difficult year. But we need to do it because it's the right thing to do. Because in the absence of doing it, community will fray. Community needs to be tended and it needs to be treasured and it needs to be done through a lens of social capital. And that's my presentation. The future is calling all of us. It's time for us to leave a better Christchurch to those people that come after us. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Always a wonderful lot of insights and some really interesting, slightly depressing things in your presentation. So he obviously didn't get the memo that this was about resilient optimism and not the other way around. But anyway, the reality is we do have some pretty significant challenges ahead of us, as well as some good stuff. I do think, however, some of the audience questions that you asked were a little flawed because, people generally got here about 7 o'clock, probably, if you're lucky, one coffee on board. So to ask, if the days, your best days were behind you today or ahead of you, maybe if you asked after 10:30, after 3 coffees on board, maybe the results might be slightly different. Just saying. So anyway, look, we're now on to the time where we would like you to use this online platform. Hopefully it's going to come up on screen. I better not press that because someone else will do it. And we've got a question for you. So just a reminder, the details are, if you go onto your phone and you type in pigeonhole.at/chamber, you will come up with a platform. What we're going to do is we're going to have about 10 minutes for you to discuss and send through your answers to a question, which, yes, you can see it behind me. It's a little small on my screen, but you can see it hopefully a little bit better there. So the question is, how do we change the perception of Christchurch as a city that is recovering from a decade of disaster to a city that is full of new and exciting opportunities with a quality of life second to none? What did you call them? Kind fibs. I've been telling kind fibs apparently for a long time, but I actually genuinely believe that. And that is attractive to both prospective residents and to businesses. So what we want you to do is turn around, have a chat to your neighbour. You can work on this together or you can work on it individually, but given the loneliness stats, I'd suggest that you work on it with your neighbour. And then you've got about 10 minutes to have a bit of a chat. Put your answers into the platform. If you like the look of someone else's answer, you can actually just click on that and it upvotes it. And then when we are finished, we're going to come back, we're going to have a panel discussion, and we'll use the panel discussion to have a look at your answers and get a bit of a conversation going. So thank you. You've got 10 minutes and we'll be back. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Hello. Hello, hello. Welcome back. Wow. What amazing information you've just provided us with. Thank you so much. We were a little unsure about whether or not this bit would work, because normally our audiences are sometimes a little slow with questions and comments, but amazing. So thank you so much. There's some really great information there. So welcome back also to Carl Davidson and the two new people that are joining us, Ellie Adams from ChristchurchNZ, the CEO, and Graham Grant, the CEO of Sequent. So I just want to start off by trying to summarise some of what I've read, and apologies, I'm not going to get to all of it because there's way more than what I could actually read through in that short space of time. But generally, the themes were something around definitely the importance of a really vibrant and welcoming central city, creating the right environment, the right settings for good outdoor dining, lots of temporary projects where we can really sort of play and experiment to create that vibrancy, making sure that we get our vacant land developed, making sure we fix what is broken, changing the perceptions, the negative perceptions that are often skewed by the media, so the role of media, but the role that we can also all play by telling stories through multiple different channels, focusing in on what makes us special, the sectors and the innovation, and some of those, what was it, Carl, your honest fibs, or your something about your fibs? Kind fibs. Go the kind fibs. Also making sure that we've got good connections between business, education and the environment, and our arts, our really rich arts and cultural settings and communities that we have here. So that was a really, really quick way of summarising what you've provided us with. I apologise if I've missed something that you've actually put in there. We will definitely make sure that we pick up on this as we move forward. So we're now going to ask some questions. Again, lots of questions. I'm just going to pull this over here. Oops. I did say to Holly, I apologise in advance if I drop this because it's very slippery. Now I can't even get it to work. Bear with me. Here we go. So, this is probably, some of you have addressed some questions here specifically to Carl. In fact, one of the, there were two things in the comments. One was to get Carl to talk at Riverside every lunchtime. So we'll have a chat to him about that after that. And the other one referred to getting Big Phil to do our marketing. So I'm assuming that might be you, Mr. Mayor. So we'll pick up on those two. But this one, I'll put forward to perhaps Carl and Ali first off, and certainly you're welcome to chip in too, Graham. How can we leverage off the current government funding to make the central city more vibrant and be a great place for businesses to be? Ali, that's probably a bit in your camp, so we might start with you, and then we'll move on to the others.
Thanks, Leanne. So, look, I think there is zero doubt that we have to have a vibrant, thriving central city for Christchurch to be successful, both on a domestic and an international stage. It has to be. It's best for residents, it's best for visitors, it's best for businesses if we have that central city working. And it's a really fine balance. You're always kind of dealing with scale of how much kind of vibrant nightlife do you have versus how much noise do you have. You'll be aware of lots of the conversations going on at the moment. It is a very finely tuned piece of work. At ChristchurchNZ, what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at what we're calling the cultural sort of heart of the city, sort of from Riverside and Cashel Mall up to Kilmore Street. And thinking about how we can connect different parts of that to make sure that it becomes a place where people do feel really safe, because we know that our visitors come to Christchurch because it is a really safe city, and it is relatively safe. That's not denying any of the things that Leanne and Carl talked about, but it is relatively safe, and it's important we make people feel like that. So some of the things we're looking at, I was really excited to see on here, this idea about experimenting. Because that's exactly what we're doing in our role. We have an urban development part of ChristchurchNZ. Many of you may not know that. It's a relatively new part of what we do. And we are doing exactly what someone put up there, which is small experiments. We're trying to see what works, whether it's an event or an art installation or something that just to see whether or not it actually does what we hope it does. And we're doing them on a small scale, and we're doing them fast, and we're failing fast and learning like a startup would do, so that we can actually determine where we're going to put our significant levels of investment. And one of the things that we're looking at is, for example, some nighttime illumination. Now, that would fill two purposes. You could potentially have nighttime illumination that was an attraction for people to come and see, but also helps to tick that safety box. So that's where we're trying to be quite creative. It is crucial that we have a central city that works. It's not the be-all and end-all. It doesn't mean the suburbs aren't important, but we have to get our central city right, because it's what people see, and we know it's where most people that visit the city actually do come, and I was pleased to see that in your work as well, Carl.
Yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts. So what I didn't say, because I didn't have time, was the number of people who now say the central cities where they take visitors has grown significantly, and the number of people who think Christchurch is headed in the right direction has grown as well. The other point I wanted to make, and again, I didn't quite have time, the takeaway from our presentation isn't that Christchurch is an unsafe place full of misery and you should not come here. That's not what it meant at all. By national standards, Christchurch does really well in terms of safety, even in terms of social cohesion and connection. It's just that we could do better. These are two different lenses. So for God's sake, if you're talking to people about Christchurch, don't tell them that people are scared of going out at night time. That's not the message, right?
Thank you. Graham, do you have anything to add, or would you? No? Great. Look, one of the other questions that has come through from your feedback, and one that I know is very relevant to some of the comments that you made on the question, is how can we ensure that Christchurch and Canterbury are seen as attractive destinations for future workers and investors, and also businesses who want to relocate and set up here. And Graham, I might start with you. I mean, you're an international business. You attract people to come and work here. You know a little bit about investors coming here as well. Yep. So what's your thoughts on that? What can we do more of to make sure that we continue to see?
Is it going?
Yep.
So, so caveat first. So I've worked mostly more outside New Zealand than in, far more outside New Zealand than in a business here that's based here that looks 99.9% of its time outside New Zealand. So we have a very external orientation, so we're not so much an inbound orientated business, and we're certainly not local in terms of manufacture and those sorts of things. So take everything I say, with that caveat in mind, but I'll try and sort of take the role of being a provocateur in the conversation to sort of move things along a bit.
That's why you're here.
What's that?
That's why you're here.
I think we have sort of two-level problems. One is we've got a brand New Zealand problem, and I know that as Kiwis we like to sort of, we have the kind fib, that everything's good, everything's green. But I'm not sure the world sees it that way. And I think, the sort of great reset globally has caused a reset in New Zealand perceptions. At least that's my take. Part of the world we like to think looks kindly on New Zealand, but part of the world's woken up to the fact that New Zealand has operated rather strangely in the last 2 years. And I think from a business perception point of view, aside from inbound wealthy investors who are coming here for their personal reasons, if you're coming here to invest, why? And so I think we've got a sort of fundamental brand issue which has been deeply impacted, and I'm not sure how we're going to bring that back again because we have limited power. So there's problem one. And in problem two, once the business comes here, why Canterbury? And I think that we might start to unpick this. Some of this in the session will time out, but we do have a profiling brand problem with Canterbury, I think. And I know within Canterbury, we love Canterbury, and we vote for Canterbury and hooray, but that doesn't really matter, because what matters is the question's framed from the perspective of someone on the outside, and I think we've got a brand problem, and we've got to deal with that.
Ellie, I know you're itching to get in here, but I'm going to go to Carl first, because I'm going to leave you with the last word, because I fully appreciate that you're doing a huge amount of work within, and I know you well enough to know. So,
well,
Carl.
If we ever get over those problems and finally get people to come here, we need to solve the social capital issue. That's precisely why we asked those questions we asked. There's a bunch of questions in that research about, do you think Christchurch and Canterbury is welcoming to people from overseas? Do you think it's welcoming to people from different parts of New Zealand? And did you have a welcome experience? That's why we asked the question, how hard do you think it is to make friends? Some of the research we do seems to suggest that people who are new to Christchurch think Christchurch people are incredibly friendly, and that it's really easy to go and have a cup of coffee with someone, but they never invite you to their house for dinner. So they let you in so far and no further. That's a neighbourhood social cohesion problem. If you want people to stay, we need to form better connections with them. Amy Carter from the Christchurch Foundation says, Canterbury has shallow soils but deep roots. What we need to do is help the people who are new to Canterbury form some of those deep roots.
Over to you, Ellie.
Look, I think it's a brilliant comment, actually. And I was living in Europe during a lot of COVID, and I think a lot of the observations that you make are right. And the last thing I ever want us to do is be complacent as a city and as a country about our place in the world. That's exactly why. So we've just started a big piece of work, and it touches on what you've talked about with social license, but it also touches on the brand. We're doing a piece of work where we're looking at the city narrative, what makes Christchurch famous, what makes us special on the world stage. And we're also looking at a destination management plan, both for the Banks Peninsula and for the broader Christchurch region, which looks at moving away from destination attraction, come to Christchurch, it's great, and thinks about the social capital and the social licence and what impact does cruise have on people that live in Littleton and the number 28 bus and all those things that you'll have read about. So it's really important that we do that in conjunction. The thing that we did is we very, very deliberately employed an international agency to do that because we didn't want to look at it from our own biased lens. So we hired an international agency called Resonance. They're based in Canada and New York. They did have some local people that were part of their consortium. And they did a piece of work where they looked at, they interviewed 14,000 people, or they did 14,000 questionnaires. They spoke to a lot of people within Christchurch. They talked to residents, to visitors, to businesses. Some of the things that came out from that piece of work were actually, we're really rubbish at telling our stories, and that came out very clearly in the questionnaire just now. So we're really good at some. We all know Christchurch is great, but we are really, really shy about it. For some reason, we do not want to say we're good. So we are looking at ChristchurchNZ to tell some of those great stories. One of the bits, they had 7 beautiful insights that came out of this, which I must share with you, Carl, but one of them was that we make things the world didn't even know they needed. So, that's amazing. We are a really great city for doing business, but nobody knows because we just assume. And maybe it's that we like it being the best secret, I don't know. So do I think there's work to do on our brand? Absolutely. I think we have to ladder up to and complement that New Zealand brand, because the other point I would make is one of scale and collaboration. So we are a small city in a small country on the far side of the world. Fact. So I know we're the centre of our own universe, but we are actually pretty little. And when you look at the numbers and finance that countries, even close like Australia, are spending to attract businesses, business events to their cities and to their country, we cannot compete on a scale that we're just never going to have that money. So we've got to be smart, we've got to be scrappy, we've got to think like a startup. And part of that is that we've got to align. So that's why it's so important that we have a city narrative that everyone believes. And this is not a city narrative for ChristchurchNZ. This is a city narrative for everyone within Christchurch to get behind, so that we're all saying the same things about Christchurch, because then we have a much higher share of voice on the international scale. So I've run out of time and I should stop, but I really...
Did you notice I was leaning closer to my microphone?
I did.
But it does lead me quite nicely into my next question. And, we've got a captive audience of people sitting in front of us here. And yes, there is no doubt that's part of ChristchurchNZ's role, is to, to create that narrative, to, be the cheerleader for Christchurch. It's a role that I hold very dearly in my position as well. But I think we all have a role to play. So my question is, and I'll start with you, Graham, and then perhaps go to you, Carl. What role do you think the business community and the business leaders sitting in front of us here, what role do they play in changing the perception of Christchurch and Canterbury? Graham?
Yes, I think I'll pick up on Ali's point about, you scrappy and, I'll write that down, it's quite good actually. Smart and scrappy. I think that we need to shift gears, and I think, 2 things we need to do. We need to shift gears. Oh, sorry, is that right? Is that working? Yeah. We need to shift gears, and we need to shed a bit of complacency and start to, get a bit fired up. I won't have time to go back to, the comments about the social science research, but I think there is a cloak of conservatism and just keep things the way they are. I want to wear my comfortable Fair Isle jersey and remain as we are thing. And it's a thing in this city, and if you've only come from the city, you can't see it. Come from the outside, it's very, very obvious. So I think we need to deal with that, and we need to shift perceptions. Point 1. Point 2 is this work around the brand. I'm very interested to see what comes from this brand work. I'm very sure it's going to be great. We need to align behind it and get stuck in and execute, because what will happen is we'll snap back to type, put the Fair Isle jersey back on, and go, that was interesting, and then keep doing what we do. And it's so typical of the way that we tend to think. There is a thinking politic of New Zealand there more generally, and the tall poppy doesn't help. But I think we've got to get a bit of mongrel, and I think it's very important. And I'll challenge the smallness thing. Like, I know, we are small and we bob around the Pacific Ocean. Just remember Iceland, right? Nearly fell over in the GFC, But Iceland's smaller than Christchurch. It's a fully functioning country. It's got arguably limited natural resources, apart from a bit of geothermal, a few salmon and a few rocks. But their GDP per capita is higher than New Zealand. Their life expectancy is longer than New Zealand. They've got less vitamin D than us. And that doesn't make any sense at all. And yet they are an unbelievably strong functioning economy with some of the best science in the world. So go figure. And yet they're smaller than Christchurch. So I think there's a bit of kind of brain reset required here, necessary, if that's helpful.
Thanks, Graham. Carl.
Yeah, okay. So there's two perspectives, right? There's a marketing perspective and then there's a social science perspective. And the marketing perspective, I utterly agree with all of this. Like, we need passionate advocates, and businesses should be passionate advocates. But the point of the research we do says there's a social policy problem here as well, right? What you guys have to remember, and you saw this from the voting you did, you are not Christchurch, right? You are, you're a group of stakeholders, but you're at one end of a curve away from a lot of people in the population. What we've just seen played out on the national stage is if you don't take people with you, if you want to be transformative, you have to take people with you, otherwise it will end in disaster. We need a way of taking the city with us. And we would argue that thinking through a social capital lens is how we wrap our arms around those people and take it with us. And this doesn't mean at the same time we can't have people being passionate advocates, and we don't need to think small. It doesn't help anybody if we think small, but we do need to keep an eye on those people that we don't normally see.
Can I just make a comment on that? So look, I absolutely agree, and I think the importance of growing and building really balanced communities. I loved your quote at the end. It's absolutely right. And you look at the intensification discussions that have gone on recently, some of the NIMBYism that goes on in the city. We have got to address that. It is really important that we have social, equitable outcomes for all, for this city to really be successful, and it is a challenge. So, and I just kind of wanted to reiterate that as an economic development agency for the city. We are the Sustainable Economic Development Agency, which means that we do absolutely look at best for city outcomes from more than one lens. So, and that's one of the reasons that urban development has come to ChristchurchNZ, because it enables us not just to think about the bottom line. I'm sorry, Phil, because I know you want lots of money to be able to keep our rates low. But we do have to think about the social outcomes as well, and the environmental outcomes and all the other good bits that come with it.
Thank you. There's a question here that keeps popping up and up the list, which I don't particularly understand, but hopefully some of you will. How important is it that we use tactical urbanism for placemaking in our central city?
Well, was that Claire Piper's question? It's one of those experiments, right? We talked about finding ways to experiment to make the city more livable, make neighbourhoods more livable, help people form connections. That's our tool, and it's a wonderful tool, but you must have a bunch of them in your bag.
No, absolutely. I think Christchurch is in a really unique situation because we had the opportunity to rebuild, and that means that we have the opportunity to do it really brilliantly and really holistically. So, and it's really interesting. When I first joined ChristchurchNZ over a year ago, and everyone said we had an urban development function, I knew very little about urban development, in fact, zero. I assumed that it meant building stuff. It's so not about building stuff. So that is not our job. It's not our job is to actually catalyse and facilitate connected and thoughtful and holistic things throughout the city. So when we're thinking about urban reform, we've got to actually think about all the things that go with it. And the more I learn about it, the more actually I think we're in a position in Christchurch to do it in a way that hasn't been done elsewhere. I'm excited by some of the projects we've got. There's a lot I can't talk about, and I'm sorry, but there are lots of things happening, not just in the central city, but in other parts that we're looking very heavily at New Brighton and Sydenham. They're the other areas that we're really looking at driving a place-led approach, and there's lots going on.
Yeah, okay, just one last thing. It's important that we remember that people don't live in houses, they live in homes, they don't live in neighbourhoods, they live in communities. And the thing about all the work about social capital is that a network, your networks, your social networks, are no replacement for your social capital in your communities. So absolutely, we've got to build that back. So again, thinking through a social science lens as how do we get to that economic resilience through community resilience that builds a sustainable advantage.
Right. I'm going to ask sort of one more question, primarily around Central City, and then move on to some other things. I'm going to try and combine a couple here. There's a question here around what should council do to make our Central City a more attractive place for people to come and spend time. So I'm assuming that's our residents to actually fall back in love with the Central City. and also I would say Christchurch. And on the back of that is maybe, Ali, some of the work that you're doing in that space around some of the achievements that you have had off the work that you're doing in terms of, Central City promotion, events, all those sorts of things.
So you will have all noticed, I hope, that the buskers were back this year. It's the first time that we had the buskers back in the Central City whilst we had cruise ships in. So, and Carl and I were just talking about it earlier. We both kind of had a moment where I had this moment. I'd been to actually I think I might have been to the Chamber, and I was walking back across the bridge and down past the terrace, and all I could hear, there was a big group of people sitting and listening to the buskers by the Bridge of Remembrance and one up by the Scott statue there, and there was laughter and clapping and thousands of people milling around. It was a huge queue for the tram. It was a sunny day. Everyone was drinking at the terrace. And it was honestly, truly a moment where you could just see what this place could be. So events do have a really, really important part to play here, whether it's a community event like the Ide Festival that we ran last year, or whether it's the major events like the buskers. In a couple of weeks, we've got Sail GP in town. If you haven't got a ticket, it's going to be hard to be able to go and see it in Littleton, but there's going to be a massive fan site by the fabulous Tapai. So please come and do that. That's another way of us trying to activate that central city to get people in there, because the foot traffic makes a difference. And it's one of those things that actually, if you're the only person there, you feel like a bit of a wally. So, but momentum comes when you actually start to get people coming through. So the more we can get people through, the better. So yeah, lots going on in the event space.
Great. Graham, a question for you. How can we attract investment into innovative Canterbury-based global companies?
How do we attract investment? Well, I think, the assumption is that we're trying to pull in external investment, and the question is, where's that investment come from? Is it businesses coming here, or is it inbound capital supporting New Zealand businesses? So there are two separate questions. One is, on the first one, businesses coming here. Well, my question would be, have we thought really hard about whether the city, the region, starts with New Zealand government and then works down into the region, creates pathways and facilitates access to businesses easily in this place? So I was talking to one well-known New Zealand business just last week, who I think you all know, but I won't mention his name. He went off to the City of London and said he wanted to open an office there, and the City of London said, how can we help? Throw the doors open, we'll get you here tomorrow. Do we throw the doors open? I'm asking that as a question, and I think there needs to be honest retrospection as to whether that's true. On the second question of inbound capital to support New Zealand businesses, that's important because you can't scale without capital, and the capital market in New Zealand is quite limited. So it goes back to my point about brand, goes back to my point about communication and making ourselves visible and known that we're not. And so, then we're into conversations about the venture capital markets and the equity markets, but I think there could be a whole lot more done to help us explain who we are and what we've got here. So again, we're right back to branding, right back to communication.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the clapper.
One of my team in the back wants a pay rise. Who's that?
It's probably one of your staff members.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a question here around after the earthquakes in Christchurch, employers had to invest strongly in welcoming and settlement initiatives for newcomers to help with the rebuild. How can we prompt employers to do this again? And I'm just going to pipe in there and suggest that I think we did a fantastic job in Christchurch during that period. Employers really stepped up and did their work. But the one massive lever that we're missing at the moment is the current immigration settings. So at the moment we have a significant issue in terms of being seen as an attractive destination, because we're not welcoming for for migrant workers at the moment, and we're doing all that we can to advocate to government very strongly around that. But I don't know if anyone else wants to sort of add a comment around that. Sorry, that's quite a political answer from my perspective, but
I think I'll offer a point. I think I was hoping this issue might come up, but it's a good chance. So we're talking to Chippy on Friday, and then Luxton on next Friday. And so the point I make is what we've done with immigration is close to a national crime. I think it's that bad. I think we're largely in business in the room, so I'm certain everyone would have experienced similar things domestically here, but my experience talking to smaller businesses are the ones I really feel for, because they have the less buying power, the less branding, the less attraction, whereas a larger business have that, is terrible. We've all got the stories, but a landscaping business I spoke to just this week, the guy's worked for 3 months non-stop without a day off, and because he can't let his clients down, and his staff have gone back overseas. So as a technology business, to put this in specifics, and you'll all have your own stories, we can hire senior developers into New Zealand relatively easy if they're north of $130,000 a year. What about the young developers? What about bringing new talent in? We can't. Bricky, British builder here in Christchurch, been here for 5 years, can't get a pathway to residency. Madness. And so, I don't know how many times, I've spoken to the Minister of Immigration about this, who I really wondered if he understood anything about business, and then I heard the next Minister of Immigration saying, no, it's all okay. This is quite serious, and I think, I'm hoping it becomes a point for conversation in the next 2 weeks.
Well, that is one of the reasons you are joining me to meet the Prime Minister tomorrow, Graham, because I'm hoping that you'll make exactly the same comment, because he's sick of hearing from me about it.
It could be an interesting conversation.
I think this goes to your point about 4 out of 5 businesses in your survey think we're headed in the wrong direction. I just want to go back to the previous point about the inner city, about how do we attract people to the inner city. This is a really important point. The question was framed, how do they, in this case Christchurch City Council, drive inner city vibrancy? There is no they, there's only we, right? And so what we all need to be thinking about is, what can we do? What's the contribution we can make through the levers we pull? Think social capital, bonding, linking. How do we drive to that outcome rather than sit back and point to somebody else and say they're not achieving that outcome?
Good question. The next question, Carl, probably this is pretty dear to your heart, I'm sure, given the work that you do across the city, working with a lot of young people. How do we attract young leaders of the future across a wide range of disciplines to live, work and play in the city?
Did you say attract or trap?
Both.
Right. It's a really interesting question, right? UC is in the room, particularly the business school. Do we want those people to go away and come back and bring different skills? Is interesting. So what is the pathway to them? What is it those young people are looking for? We all know the phenomenon when they return to raise their kids here, because we see it part of our brand problem. It's a great place to raise kids, but we don't see it necessarily as a great place to drive innovative business. So that could well be a perception thing. But also, we need to think about a life stage development as well, right? A lot of us left and came back and brought our skills, so why wouldn't we encourage people to do that? Is there a way we can bond them? Is there a way we can incentivise them?
Anyone else want to make some comments on that?
I guess, look, from my perspective, I think you're absolutely right. It's a really interesting question, because I think the international perspective does really bring a lot. So I think COVID has also created something special, because now actually Christchurch, I think traditionally Christchurch is a place where you left if you wanted a career and you stayed if you wanted a lifestyle. You had to choose between the two. I think increasingly that's changing. I still think we're complacent if we think we're there. But I do think remote working and the fact that you can actually work for a Silicon Valley company based here in Christchurch, if that's what you want to do, opens it up to make it slightly more attractive for people. But I do think your point is valid, that maybe it's a good thing that people go away and come back.
Well, let's not forget, one of the great assets Christchurch's got is the tertiary education sector. The University of Canterbury, of course, what was Arda Ngātapakenga, Lincoln. People come from throughout the island to Christchurch to study tertiary education. And if we can hold on to them, that'll be great for our economy. If we could attract them back, that would also be great. Just a quick plug here, if you've got a UC MBA, they're going to launch a lifelong learning program for alumni. Talk to Paul on the way out.
Thank you. Right, we've got about 5 more minutes, and I've got more than that questions to get through. So I'm just trying to pick one without getting some enemies in the room. There's one here actually around spreading wealth throughout the local economy. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the central city and why that's so important. But this is about, I guess, encouraging things like, tourists to come and stay outside of the central city in Airbnbs and those sorts of things, so they can see other parts of our city as well. Any comments on that from Ali?
Well, I think this is where the destination management plan becomes really important. So we're really carefully thinking through our destination management plan about what the city needs and how we split up and balance the visitor economy across the city. And that includes things like Banks Peninsula, which is really interesting. So Banks Peninsula is a real jewel in our crown. We're very, very fortunate to have it. So how can we make sure that the visitor economy that we get there and how we attract people there really meets the needs of the locals as well. So, and it's making sure that we do really have a balanced, everything is about balance, isn't it? And I'm going to use that word a lot, and there's a clue to our city narrative there. So, but everything is about balance. We have got to have a balanced city.
Fantastic, thank you. Again, we focused a lot on Christchurch. There's people from the audience outside of Christchurch, wider Canterbury region. So just a comment here, how do we leverage the greater Christchurch approach to regional attraction? Because actually we know when Canterbury does well, Christchurch does well. When Christchurch does well, Canterbury does well.
Can I just make a comment? So the two destination management plans that we're doing, one is for Banks Peninsula because it has a very specific need, and the other is for Ashburton, Waimakariri, Selwyn and Christchurch together. So we are actually thinking about how we attract people to that whole region rather than just to Christchurch. So from an attraction point of view, that's true. From a business point of view, it's also really true. We try really hard, and one of the things I was going to say earlier is, it's really hard with business attraction. When you're attracting business, we have a big business attraction part of what we do, and we do try and roll out the red carpet, and we do try and make sure we make it as easy as possible to attract businesses to come here. But we've got to make sure we're not racing each other to the bottom as New Zealand Inc., and we've got to particularly make sure we don't do that across Canterbury. The worst case scenario is if Selwyn and Waimak are fighting for the same businesses that we've got, because actually getting someone in the region is good for all of us. So there is just a balance, and we just have to make sure we continue to work together on that.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, I'm going to do one final question for each of you, and then I've got one question for all of you. So, Carl, I'll ask, this one is for you. Of the 10% of people who adamantly believe Christchurch was better before the earthquakes, do we know why they say this? What are their reasons?
No, we don't, but we know who they are. So I should have said when I talked about that survey, again, not enough time to go into it, the Pulse of Christchurch survey is deliberately set up so it mirrors the population of Greater Christchurch. So we know who those people are. We don't know why they think that. That'd be a qualitative piece of research. Yep. We have some ideas, but I'm not going to argue ahead of the data.
Thank you. This is probably for Ellie, but I'm actually going to ask Graham instead, and I'm going to ask Ellie another one. From your perspective, Graham, how can we expedite the major projects around the city? Yeah, sorry. Come on, now's your opportunity.
So I presume we mean the major infrastructure projects. I'm not sure you asked that. So Parakiori and the Te Kaha. How can we expedite? Look, great question. So I wish I had Te Kaha now. It would make things a lot easier. Trust me, it would be wonderful if we had that in our city portfolio so that we could do it. Look, I think we're doing all we can. So are we a bit late? Yes. Are we doing what we can? Yes. Christchurch has an incredible physical capital. We have an amazing infrastructure at the moment, whether it's Naval Point that's part of coming out of Sail GP, whether it's the Adventure Park, whether it's going to be Parakiori when it comes online, or whether it's the fabulous Te Pai. We truly have some incredible infrastructure, and we have to make sure that we utilise it and fill it, and that costs money. Now, we're very lucky, and Phil's gone, or I would thank him, but the council has agreed as part of its annual plan that events are an important part of attraction, because if you get people to a business event, or if you get people to a major event, then actually they tend to have a positive experience of the city, and then they might come back as a leisure visitor, and then they might come back and invest as a business. So we're really lucky that the council has seen that infrastructure needs to be filled, and they have invested accordingly. So
I thought Phil left when I asked that question, actually, but he may not have. Might have been a coincidence. Last question, not too sure who wants to ask this one. How do we make sustainability at our heart, carbon neutral, diverse workplaces, etc.? And we saw, some of the feedback that we got through the Chamber's survey, that actually, our business community take this very seriously. They're doing a lot of great work in this space. So how do we replicate that, I guess, across the city?
So another piece of work that we're looking at is the economic aspiration for Christchurch, and there is absolutely zero doubt that it has to be around a net positive type economy. That's our long-term ambition. We're miles off being net positive. We're somewhere between extractive and sustainable if we're generous. So then you get to circular, but if you really want to be regenerative, you've got a long way to go. We do have some amazing beacons in the city that are doing this really well, and we're looking to try and leverage and tell those stories better. I think what's really important is that all parts of the ecosystem have to come together to make it work, whether it's regulation and central government, whether it's incentives, whatever it might be, all the different bits of the ecosystem are the only way that you can actually start to get towards a regenerative and sustainable economy. And I think the other point I would make is when we did a business survey, in fact it might have been one of yours, Leanne, it came out really clearly that everyone knew there's this difference between urgent and important. Everyone knows that climate change is really important, but we're just worried about keeping the lights on and getting the staff and dealing with the challenges that Sophie talked about earlier. So because of that, that means that there is a role to play for people like ourselves and the Chamber and the Council to make sure that we're thinking long term, because those things are going to creep up faster than we think.
Yeah, good point. There is a question here which I'll half by answer without it going to the crew here. 8 weeks to get a study visa, it's a question and a statement. Means students are going to Australia too. Immigration policy is very unhelpful for our unis and our training organisations. How can we flag this is important? We will be doing that tomorrow with the Prime Minister and next week with the Leader of the Opposition, Christopher Luxon. So thank you, Lisa, for that question. I'm assuming it might have been you. My final question, and this has to be quick fire because I'm very conscious that you do need to go in about 7 minutes, Graham. So very quick answers from all of you, starting with you, Carl. What is the one thing that keeps you in Christchurch?
I get quite emotional about this. This is my Turanga Waiwai. This is my place to stand. It's the story I tell. I'm going to get buried here. I'm not going anywhere.
Hard to follow that one, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a place I chose, which is also very meaningful, and my citizenship ceremony was very meaningful here because it is a place I chose. There's a difference between kind of being born here, which you get that, or choosing somewhere, but they both have very deep roots, and after the earthquake I think people chose to put their roots down or leave, and for me it was a turning point in building roots. What keeps me here? Guess what? Balance.
Graham, you could live anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I could. And look, I think I'm very fortunate that I work for a world-class business that's headquartered here. We're not fully based here, but headquartered here. We are changing the world at the scale of industry all over the world. That's largely not recognised here. And that's pretty extraordinary. And it came from a business, it was spun out of another Canterbury business. It's still here. And we fought pretty hard to keep it here. It could have been gone in a heartbeat. But we locked it in, and now it's a ram set to the floor, so we're pretty happy about that. So I'll stay here with the business.
Yeah, we are very grateful that decision was made, and very, very lucky to have you here, so thank you. Can I have a round of applause for our panellists, please? Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Ellie to say some final words. Thank you very much from me. My final words are spread your kind fibs, be smart and scrappy, shed complacency and be a bit more mongrel. Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. Look, I've loved that. It was really great. I always enjoy a panel where there's lots of controversy and interesting, good debate. Could have gone on for hours, I'm sure. So I probably will. I'm sure over a beer at some point. So look, I just want to thank you all for coming. And for your interaction and enthusiasm. It's been really great to see so many people here. Special thanks to all the presenters and people who've taken part. So Leanne, Sophie, Carl. And Graham. And special thanks to the Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce and to Research First for collaborating on this event. It's the first time we've tried it. I hope it won't be the last, but we would love your feedback. So we're trying to kind of get a bit more effective and efficient. And a special thanks to ANZCO for partnering to help produce it. Also thank you to the Majestics, great venue. They've made us all feel welcome and comfortable. Thanks to the elected members who turned up today. I know Phil had to leave, but it was great to see everybody here. And I hope you all learned something new. I know that I certainly did. Look, it's really easy to not do these things in person. We got very used to Zooming and we got very used to working remotely, but when you get together in person, there's nothing quite like it. So hope to see you at our next one of these. Thank you very much again, and have a lovely day.
Can we just talk? Can we just talk?